ethnicity, and/or gender. The term racism and its derivative term racist. People who use these terms literally don't have a clue as to what they mean or the concepts and phenomena they are trying to describe. In point of fact, these terms have no meaning. They don't exist. They are false vernacular and colloquial propaganda terms that the corporate media created and the forces behind the scenes controlling the media and other aspects of a society, call the forces the deep state or whatever, but I will get into that angle below and later, have been using to program and indoctrinate the general populace for more than 50 years now. They have been systematically and longitudinally indoctrinating people to accept a Jewish invention, a Jewish ism, which I've named victimism, which functions, among other things, as a substitute for traditional religion. The technical term for racism, racist, from the social sciences is ethnocentrism, which occurs when members of a group, usually racial, ethnic, religious, national, very naturally consider members of their own group superior to all other competing groups, regardless of knowing little to nothing about those outgroups. The invalid term racism attempts to describe attitudes. Opinions and Personality by M. Brewster Smith, Jerome S. Bruner, and Robert W. White, 1956. Back in the late 70s, I was fishing around in the University of Miami graduate stacks when I stumbled upon this book. This book had a profound influence on my ideas about how humans process political, moral, and religious attitudes, and motivated me a few years later when I matriculated to Cal to study the new interdisciplinary field of political psychology, with several of its pioneers, including Herbert McCloskey, Philip Tetlock, and Aaron Wildavsky. I worked as an undergraduate research assistant for all three and others, like Mervyn Friedman. What most people fail to understand is that ethnocentrism, or as they call it, racism, is a concept that attempts to describe an attitude or syndrome of attitudes. In social science, attitudes are defined by the ABC model of attitudes. All attitudes have three components: an affective or emotional component, A, behavioral component, B, and a cognitive component, C. The cognitive component is a learned tendency to evaluate things in a certain way. Example, attitudes towards spiders. Affective, I am scared of spiders. Behavioral, I will avoid spiders and scream when I see one. Cognitive, knowledge or belief about spiders. I believe spiders are dangerous. The affective component is primary. If the affective component is lacking, you do not have a true attitude, and therefore you do not have a true case of racism, ethnocentrism. If the affective component is present, but the cognitive component is based on hard evidence, scientific research, statistics, random sampling, lifelong experience, then again, you do not have a case of racism, ethnocentrism. There is nothing prejudicial or discriminatory about cognitive conclusions when they are based on statistics, lifelong, repetitive, personal experience, or hard evidence of any kind. The term racism is a negative feeling toward the objects of one's racism, not a thought. The thought motivates the feeling, but if you lack the feeling part, you lack the attitude, and therefore you are not a racist. The most interesting aspect of Smith, Bruner, and White's studies is that they correlated political and other attitudes with measurable cognitive and personality traits and discovered that attitudes towards political and other subjects serve a psychological function for all of us. In their series of studies, they found that any political attitude can serve one of four distinct functions for a person holding the attitude in question. 1, an object appraisal function. 2, a value expressive function. 3, a social adjustive function. 4, an ego defensive or externalization, as they called it, function. The first two functions, object appraisal and value expression, are considered psychological healthy functions, while the last two, the social adjustive and the ego defensive, are considered psychologically unhealthy. Object appraisal serves the knowledge function based on honest and objective assessment of the target of the attitude. It is based on logic, reason, and evidence. This is a healthy attitude function. Value expression function serves the purpose function of helping us in the expression of our own self-concept and seeks to present who we are to the world. This is also a healthy function. The social adjustive function helps us to identify with a group and to gain group approval. It basically serves the function of conformism. We assume an attitude or series of attitudes not because we really feel that way, but in order to be accepted, liked, respected, admired by others, whether or not we truly feel the way we present ourselves to the group. The ego expressive or externalization function serves to help us deal with inner psychological problems to protect ourselves from disturbing self-knowledge, projection, displacement, repression, and denial. Object appraisal and value expression functions allow us to see the object of any attitude honestly. When an attitude serves a social adjustive function, it implies the holder of the attitude is willing to distort his view of the attitude object, and therefore is willing to distort his reality in order to conform and be liked and accepted. When an attitude serves an ego defensive or externalization function, we will allow our personal inner problems to distort our perception of the attitude object and/or other subjects of the world. Other legitimate ways of making very general statements about groups are the concepts of modal personality and national character, both of which have a long history in social science research. One angle on my critique of postmortem America and Americans is that there's virtually no one left in this country whose attitudes are not exclusively founded upon a social adjustive and/or ego defensive function. In other words, today's crop of Americans constitute a true herd. My use of the term herd as a technical term in my critique is different from any previous use of the term, including that of Nietzsche, Jose Ortega, David Felton, Robin Greene, David Dalton, Holly Sklar, Edward Abbey, John Gray, C.S. Lewis, Jean-François Revel, Robert Payne, Dick Meyer, the Club of Rome, David Ehrenfeld, Alan Bloom, Colin Wilson, Norman Podhoretz, Hilton Kramer, Charles Murray, Roger Kimball, Baudrillard, Edward Shills, Irving Kristol, James Q. Wilson, Robert Bork, Ralph Nader, Robert R. MacArthur, or others. In my use of the term, everyone in the country, in fact, everyone on this planet is a member of the herd. I'm not included since I'm not on this planet often enough. When I hear the word racism, racist, I immediately think of the word emails. There is no such thing as the word emails, S with a plural S, or the word email used as a verb. What does the E in the word emails stand for? The E stands for electronic. The full form is electronic-mail. The term is one of those where the singular and the plural form are the same, like deer. You don't say, look at those 10 deers in that field over there. You say, look at those 10 deer over there, or look at that one deer over there. Look at that one deer over here. So one cannot send a bunch of emails, only a bunch of email messages or email letters. Why is this important? No reason. It's important to me as a retired IT guy because it annoys me interminably. The reason it's important to society is that it is one small example of what a few of my projects are about. The degree to which it demonstrates how postmortem Americans take everything for granted, unless, of course, as I always say, Nick, they can either eat it, fuck it, or accelerate it. More importantly, still, it shows how not only do postmortem Americans fail to examine any of the assumptions they base ideas, opinions, and attitudes upon, but even worse, they're not even aware of the concept assumption to begin with. So they basically take everything for granted. I call this corruption via comfort. This is one of the things that makes me a freak in intellectual, literary, and philosophical history. I instinctively examine all the assumptions I am basing any truth-functional statement I am thinking over or considering or arguing out with myself on. Then I list all the assumptions buttressing those assumptions, and then those assumptions on and on backwards in an infinite regress. There are multiple infinite regresses going on in my head at any one time, which should help people understand why I'm so psychotic. Formal social scientific research into racism began in the 1930s with the Bennington study. Mervyn Friedman and the Bennington College study. When I was in college, I had the opportunity to work as research assistant for some of the greatest social scientists in the history of the field. That period was one of my most formative intellectually. One of them was Dr. Mervyn Friedman, professor of psychology at San Francisco State. Dr. Friedman was part of the follow-up team for Theodore Newcomb, the principal investigator of the Bennington study. That study took place over many decades, starting in the early 30s, and sought to show how college education can induce attitude change through indoctrination of students and how permanent those changes can be. The main attitudes that were studied were related to ethnocentrism. This study is revolutionary because it was the first attempt by serious social science, to take up the issue of ethnocentrism and racial and ethnic prejudice and discrimination. After working, footnote, please see PowerPoint presentation titled "The American People Are Corrupt, Not the Politicians or the Corporations." After working with Dr. Friedman, I had social scientific foundation to learn about these issues further on my own. Consensus research on race and ethnicity at this stage of history very strongly suggests that ethnocentrism is hardwired, probably genetically, into the Homo sapiens psyche. There are no exceptions. Muzaffar Sharif and his wife Carolyn and the Robbers Cave experiments. I've said many times in response to dipshits talking bullshit about things they know nothing about, like racism, that 5% of Americans are racist and the other 95% lie. The Sharifs and co-researchers demonstrated that this is a fact in their famous Robbers Cave experiments. They took a group of boys to summer camp at a park in Oklahoma called the Robbers Cave Park and divided them up into groups. They allowed the boys to build up a sense of group cohesion and identity to the point where they were competing aggressively and violently toward the other groups. Once the in-group identities had been absorbed by the boys, they naturally became very ethnocentric, making up stereotyped stories and inventing slurs to describe the other groups. A few years later, the Sharifs and their associates replicated the experiment at a summer camp in Connecticut with similar results. Since then, what is this fucking shit, damn it? Dozens have attempted to replicate the Robbers Cave methodology. One of the important results of the study is the conclusion that humans are hardwired, probably genetically, to be ethnocentric. What this means to American idiots and others, among other things, is that all racial, ethnic, religious, and national groups are racist toward other groups by nature. In other words, it is not possible for a human being to not be a racist, quote unquote.